Awesome, awesome, awesome. Welcome, 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 and good morning. We are live streaming through our YouTube channel as well, so we're just giving an opportunity for people to come in. Good morning. Good morning. Believe it or not, we are on our second to last book talk before we close out for Thanksgiving. And then we will be back after Thanksgiving to start our next book. And hopefully we'll be done with that book early December, because I'm going to stop for the year after our last book. So that being said, hope everybody is doing great. We are continuing our reading of White Like Me by Tim Wise, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. And I'm also showing it to my YouTube viewers. All right. So hope everybody is having a great Motivational Monday. Today we are on day 29, and we actually are going to end this reading tomorrow. So we'll take a little break for Thanksgiving, and then we will come back on Friday with our new book talk. So this section, I think, is, if I could call it anything, I would call it Intentionally Raising Conscious Children. Intentionally Raising Conscious Children. That is what Tim Wise pretty much talks about in this section, and how to not think for your children, but really how to guide your children in terms of issues concerning race. And so he's going to, tell you a little bit about his life, but I believe that you're going to get the gist of what he's trying to say in this section. So again, if I would call this section anything, I would call it Intentionally Raising Conscious Children. I don't know about what area you live in, but here in the Northeast, it is starting to get cold. The winds are starting to kick up. And I am trying to stay away from developing a cold. So please excuse me, if you see me sipping on my hot drink here, I am just trying to maintain my vocal cords and stay away from the cold. So that's what I'm doing. All right, here we go. Parenthood. The week before the presidential election, the school that both of our girls now attend held a mock vote for students in which they got to cast their ballots for the candidate of their choice. And he's referring to the elections of 2008, I believe. Barack Obama won handily at their school and can rest assured that he received the vote of Ashton Wise and would have secured Rachel's, but she was still in preschool at the time. We hadn't tried to push either of the girls to support one candidate over the other, but it seemed almost intuitive on their parts that they would support Obama. They appeared to instinctively sense something terribly wrong with Sarah Palin and something angry and menacing about John McCain. At one point, my daughter Rachel asked me what Sarah Palin's problem was. Entirely unbidden, I should add, to which I responded somewhat tongue-in-cheek, she doesn't care if the polar bears die, and she likes to shoot moose. Both Ashton and Rachel were horrified. When my father-in-law went to dinner with them one night, wearing a button with the pictures of McCain and Palin on it, Rachel took one look at the button and said, "There's that crazy lady who hates polar bears." Some things, as you see, get lost in translation. I tell this story mostly because it symbolizes, for me at least, how children pick things up, how they are indeed always picking things up, for good or bad, from their parents, the media, peers, or any number of other sources. By our statements, our actions, or alternately by our silence and inactions, we teach lessons constantly, and children are incredibly adept at learning them, even when we think they aren't paying attention at all. This is why, when it comes to race, parents have to be very deliberate and mindful of the lessons we're imparting to our kids. Now, I don't know if you are familiar or if you had heard about, even in the news lately, that some 13-year-old children beat up an 8-year-old on the playground at a school, after school, who was protecting his little sister. And, they were racially motivated, and they were motivated by the president-elect and some of the things that they said to this child. And this child wound up being beat up so badly that he had to go to the hospital, and he had, I believe, a broken arm from this encounter with these children. Well, it turns out that these children that were happened to be on the playground that beat up this black boy for defending his little sister, they were children of the teachers at the school. So yeah, that's not good. And then the school turns around and says, well, we're not going to punish the children because, quote unquote, it happened after school hours. So, of course, the parents are looking into what they can do legally, but that just speaks a lot to, number one, the school, number two, the administration, number three, the teachers of the children that were beating up children that was racially motivated. I wouldn't want those teachers anywhere near my children, by the way. So again, as he points out here, sadly, too often, parents, and especially white parents, begin by sending the wrong messages to children when it comes to race. Over the years, I've asked several hundred people in workshops, when was the first time you really noticed someone of a different race or color than yourself, and what happened? And by far, the most common reply has had something to do with seeing a person of color in a supermarket or mall while shopping with one's parents. Time after time, whites will describe a similar scene. They noticed the person who looked different. They tugged on their mom or dad's clothes to get their attention. They referenced the person they'd seen while pointing at them. And then they were met by forceful and immediate shh from the parent. To the parent, the shush means one thing, but to the child, it means quite another. To the adult, the shush is likely intended as a short, sharp way to convey the notion that pointing is rude. But to the child, especially a very young, the shush suggests that something is wrong, specifically with the person being referenced. It says, don't notice that person, or even maybe that person is bad or dangerous, and one should be quiet around them so as not to attract their attention. The kind of thing you might be told were you to happen upon a dangerous wild animal while on a camping trip. When white parents shush their children, when those children have merely pointed out something different for which they have no words or explanation, they send a message of negativity with regard to the difference being noticed. I can think of real quick an instance that happened to my husband just like that, because he is a very tall, chocolate-colored, full of melanin man. He's 6'5" 3/4", and he's a pretty big dude, but he's a big teddy bear. And so I remember him telling me that he was in a store, and a little white girl walked past him and pointed and said to her mother, "Mommy, look at that big dark man. He's really black." And she yelled it, and it made the parent really, really embarrassed. But there was really no need for the parent to be embarrassed because your child notices color, right? I get tired of people saying we are colorblind. I am not colorblind. I see all color. I see all people. I see their characteristics. I see their traits. I can see their gender, right? And There shouldn't be anything wrong with that. You should be able to say, I see color and I appreciate the various colors that God made people in his own image. I appreciate diversity. But many people don't see it that way. So instead, they lie to themselves and they say stupid stuff like, I don't see color. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Because if you're saying you don't see color, then what you're saying is you don't see me. Because I'm a person of color. All right. I have melanin in my skin that differentiates me from other people in the world. So don't go around telling people you're colorblind and you don't see color, because that's a lie. So anyway, back to what happened. So as the child yelled out, Mommy, he's a big black man, my husband actually began to engage the child. And he began to teach her, rather than take offense, rather than look the other way, because the parent was clearly embarrassed, and thought, oh my gosh, my child is making a scene. My husband actually got on the level of the child and began talking to her and began being friendly with her and began explaining to her why his skin had more color in it than hers did. And he put it in very simple, plain terms, that God made my skin with melanin. I have something in my skin, and I have more of it in my skin than you have in your skin. But hey, we're all human beings. And at the end of the conversation, which I thought was so cool, the girl turns to her mother and says, well, Mommy, I want some of that too. So it really depends on how you handle those conversations with children. Depends on what kind of, as Tim Wise says here, it depends on what kind of message you're sending your child. Is it going to be a message of negativity, that something is wrong with people with darker skin than you? Or is it going to be a message of education? Because you can educate your child and they will understand. We had another young child that asked their parents in front of us, why are they darker than us, Mommy and Daddy? And I gave the example of a Tootsie Roll to the child. I said, well, have you ever had a Tootsie Roll before? And he was like, yeah, I've had a Tootsie Roll. He's 4 years old. And I said, well, Tootsie Rolls come in all colors, don't they? You got your chocolate, you got your orange, you got your purple, you got your red. And he was like, yeah, they all come in different colors. But I said, but on the inside, they're all the same, aren't they? Once you get down to the middle or to the center of the Tootsie Roll, they're all the same. He understood that immediately. So then he turned to his parents and said, well, I want some of what they got. I want to be black too. And so again, 2 children, simple explanations, and they were able to get what it seems like we can't get some adults to understand, that on the inside, we're all the same. We're all human beings. We all have a living soul. So again, what kind of message do you want your children to experience? What kind of message are you sending to young people about people that don't look like you, don't talk like you, don't speak like you, maybe not even believe like you do? So again, it goes back to, what kind of message? Are you trying to send a message of education? Are you trying to have a teachable moment with your child? Or are you going to wind up sending a message of negativity? The other problem, he says, the way parents, and especially white ones, deal with race is that they don't deal with it at all when it comes to their children. They largely ignore it. Over the years, hundreds of white parents have proudly proclaimed to me that they rarely ever discuss racism with their children. I want my kids to be able to hold on to their innocence, some say. Others insist that children don't see color until we make them see it, as justification for their silence about race. We're raising our kids to be colorblind, still others maintain, as if such a parenting plan were the ultimate anti-racist technique, and as if avoiding the topic of racism could instill such colorblindness in the first place. But color blindness doesn't solve the problem of racism. First, it doesn't work. Kids see color, and research suggests they begin to draw conclusions about color-based differences early on. As early as preschool, children have begun to pick up cues about race and gender from popular culture, from parents, and from peers, such that they begin to form hierarchies on the basis of those identities. Kids observe the world around them and draw conclusions about that world with or without our guidance. When it comes to race, unguided conclusions can prove dangerous. Children can discern, for instance, that there are vast gaps in resources between the parts of town lived in mostly by whites and the parts of town in which mostly folks of color reside. They can see people of color disproportionately represented on the news in stories about crime and poverty. They can see mostly whites in leadership roles, the president notwithstanding. Having observed disparities, children, like anyone else, will seek to try to make sense of them subconsciously, if not consciously. And if they're being told, as most everyone in the United States, that anyone can make it if they try hard enough, but then they see that some have decidedly not made it to the extent that others have, why would it surprise us that some, and perhaps many, would conclude that there was something wrong with those at the bottom, that they were in fact inferior? And if the disparities have a distinct racial cast to them, how surprising can it be that those conclusions would be linked to notions of racial group inferiority? So unless parents are discussing inequity with children and placing it in proper social and historical context, in other words, unless you are talking to your children about discrimination and racism, past and present, those children will likely develop an internal narrative to explain away inequity they see, which will lean heavily towards a prejudicial, even racist conclusion. This is why the old saying that you have to be taught how to hate has seemed simplistic to me. Yes, if you're deliberately taught to be a racist, it certainly makes it more likely that you'll turn out to be one. But a child can be taught bias, perhaps not hatred, but certainly a form of racism, indirectly by combining their recognition of social inequality with the standard message about our society that where we end up on the ladder of life is all about our own effort, when we clearly know this is not true. There are clearly things, especially built into the American society, that allow some people to get ahead further than others based on the color line. They're simply based on history. There's been things that have put in place that have deliberately held certain people groups back from succeeding for years, for decades, before they were able to get equal treatment under the law. So to simply say to your child that life is about simply your own effort is not true. There are systems in place that deliberately have discriminated, and that has impacted and affected generations of people. As such, only color consciousness, and especially a consciousness of the way color continues to divide our society, can really prepare children to confront the world around them honestly and effectively. Perhaps even more importantly, kids pick up on inconsistencies between what we say as parents and what we do, paying far closer attention to the latter than the former. If you tell your kids not to fight, for instance, but they see you and hear you fighting with your spouse or partner, they will have a hard time internalizing the no fighting message, given the actual behavior that they're witnessing by you. Likewise, we can say we believe in diversity and equity and value multiculturalism and integration, but if we send our children to monoracial, monocultural schools, they live in a monoracial, monocultural neighborhood, and you only expose them to social settings in which everybody looks like them, they will see the inconsistency in your message and translate it as hypocrisy, and conclude that we as parents are lying to them when it comes to that which we value. Excuse me. What's more, because children tend to be egocentric, they commonly presume that their stuff is the best. their school, their neighborhood, or their circle of friends, for instance. If the schools and communities and friendship circles are overwhelmingly white, it becomes natural for children to conclude that the reason Black and brown people are not to be found in their circles must be because they aren't as good as whites. For if they were, after all, surely they'd be around us. Only if a parent is committed to living in an integrated and multicultural life can they effectively preach the same to their kids. And only if we are committed to challenging the way in which our kids sometimes presume the normalcy of the racial divisions they see, can we hope to imbue them with enough of a sociological imagination to critically assess the world around them and then change it for the better. All right, we're going into our last section for today. The good news is kids are incredibly capable of engaging these matters and at a much higher level than that for which we normally give them credit. In the past few years, I've had the opportunity to speak in dozens of middle schools and even a few elementary schools, the kids between the ages of 7 and 12. In a few cases, I've even discussed issues of race and racism with preschool children as young as 5. Contrary to what parents seem to believe, not only can they handle the subject matter, they often lead the conversations with very little formal facilitation. I've often asked children where we get our ideas about people who are different than ourselves, especially when it comes to color. Inevitably, it takes them no time to begin offering answers. From the media is the most common answer. And when I ask them what they mean, they demonstrate a savvy grasp of the way that various sources of racial imagery affects their consciousness, from television to music videos to video games to things they see on the internet. In fact, at several schools, when I've engaged kids on these matters, they can talk for half an hour straight, almost with no active facilitation, just pointing out example after example of racial imagery as well as gender and class imagery in the media, and the way those images can sometimes give a false and misleading impression about members of certain groups. One young woman at a middle school in San Francisco, for instance, told me and her peers that she had been afraid of homeless people because of the stories she had heard on the news from various crimes committed by the homeless, or how the city had been trying to move the homeless out because of so-called aggressive panhandling in commercial and tourist districts. She then mentioned how she had gotten to know a homeless man who often walked up and down the street where she and her family lived by speaking to her one day after he had asked her a question. Through their conversation, she came to realize that most of her assumptions about the homeless were wrong. Yes, she understood there may be some homeless people who fit the stereotype, but she also realized that she couldn't and shouldn't be so rigid in her thinking as to assume those things were true in each and every case. Other students have been able to discuss the way that media gives impressions about poor people, Arabs, Muslims, immigrants, especially of color, and of course, young people. In each case, the student often knows far more about the problems with the images than we likely give them credit for. But rarely they know, has anyone ever discussed these kinds of things with them or asked them to really think about the issue? Almost as soon as Ashton had turned 2 and Rachel was coming into the world, I had begun to think about how media images would impact their consciousness around race, gender, and class, and how those dynamics interact. From Disney films to advertisements, I wondered how their images of themselves and others could be misshapen by outside influences, and how my wife and I might best inoculate them against the worst aspects of those influences, especially given the way in which female body image is influenced by advertisers, and how white women are especially given, according to research, to heightened concern about weight and body type. These were the kinds of things that I knew we'd need to think about by the time they were in school. Yet we didn't want to be the kind of parents who overly police what they would see, to the point of sheltering them unrealistically. I wasn't going to be the parent who plopped the kill your television sticker on his car, or who self-righteously preened about how there was no pop culture in our home, or how Mickey Mouse was evil. Fully aware of the problems with the culture, and more than a little aware of how troubling much of Disney brand has been over the years, I nonetheless would prefer that my child talk with me about the dominant culture and develop a way to eventually critique it and to see its good and bad elements than to be kept from it only to covet it more than ever. Every now and then, Disney manages to provide a moment of opportunity for deeper discussion about important issues, though that might not have been their intent. For instance, of all the problematic Disney films out there, the only one that I really didn't want my kids to see was Pocahontas. Something about the way that Hollywood, or in this case, Burbank, have managed to characterize Matoaka, Pocahontas' real name, as an intensely spiritual stereotype whose ability to commune with nature allowed her to converse at length with an old lady in the form of a tree, struck me as troubling. Not to mention, her story is quite a bit less romantic than the Disney version, involving as it does her forced abduction by Englishmen, from which abduction she was only able to obtain release if she married John Rolfe, whose lust for her overrode concerns like her young age at the time of their first sexual encounter. Not only does Disney ignore the coerced relationship with Rolfe, they fabricate a love interest between her and the mercenary captain John Smith, which historians agree never existed. When the descendants of Pocahontas offered to help Disney tell a more accurate version of her story, Roy Disney, nephew to Walt, refused. As much as I hoped to not bring this film into my home, I ultimately capitulated when my daughter, at the age of 4, pleaded for me to purchase it while visiting Disney World in 2005. I agreed to do it, but knew in my own mind that we'd have to process the movie together and discuss the elements of the film. If not the first time we watched it, at some point in the future, I'd be watching it pen and pad in hand, taking notes for later conversation. The film was dreadful. Disney's Pocahontas is drawn as a thin, angular, and somewhat Asian-looking beauty, while her father, Chief Powhatan, is portrayed as a large, threatening Indian leader. The white characters are often drawn in less flattering ways too, although in the end the message seems to be that if we can get in touch with nature and live peacefully, if subjected to the wisdom of Grandmother Willow, the tree which Pocahontas introduces Smith to. In the wake of her capture, the English would come to decimate the Powhatan people, calls into question such a peaceful account. But to Disney, historical details such as this can't be allowed to intrude upon the telling of a good princess story. Frankly, Ashton wasn't really crazy about the movie. It didn't really hold her interest, but nonetheless, I wanted to speak with her about some of the details. Fortunate for me, that task was made easier after watching a few of the extras on the DVD. After the movie ended, we watched some of the special features, and in one particular stood out. It was a few minutes after the chief illustrator was describing his work to an auditorium filled with people. He held up an actual image of Pocahontas drawn during the time she was in England after being taken there by John Rolfe. Needless to say, she looked nothing like the image he had created, a fact about which he proceeded to joke, noting sarcastically something to the effect, "As you can see, we remain very true to the original. Ha ha ha, laughs all around. What a cut-up." I saw this as my opportunity to teach. "Hey, Ashton," I said. "Yeah," she replied. "Why do you think they decided to make her look different like that?" "What do you mean?" "Well, you saw the picture, right? The one of the real Pocahontas and how different she looked from the way the movie made her. Why do you think they did that?" "I don't know. Maybe they thought she was prettier that way." "Yeah, I bet you're right. In fact, it sort of seemed like he was making fun of the way she actually looked, huh?" "Yeah. So how do you think it'd feel if someone wanted to make a movie about your life and decided they didn't like your red hair or the color of your skin or something like that and decided to change it?" I think that would hurt my feelings. Yeah, I bet it would. So how do you think Native Americans might feel seeing him joke like that about how much prettier his version of Pocahontas is compared to the actual Pocahontas? I think they might feel bad about that, she responded, clearly taking in the point I was hoping for her to see. I think it would hurt their feelings. I don't see why they couldn't just make her look the way she really looked. Yeah, that's a good point. I guess sometimes the people who make the decisions don't always take everyone's feelings very seriously, huh? Yeah, she said, disturbed by the implications of what she'd come to see. Lesson learned, and I was glad that we had watched Pocahontas. This concludes our reading for today, and tomorrow we will be finishing up with the conclusion of White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. I hope that you learned something today, and I hope that if you have children especially, or even if you're mentoring young people, that you will keep in mind that it's very important to help them to develop their own healthy ideas and healthy dialogue around race and race issues, and to not ignore the questions that they have when it concerns race, but also, as he talked about in the book today, putting racial inequity in proper context, putting it in historical and social context, and not just letting kids assume that things are the way they are because there are no external factors surrounding those conditions. So we'll be back tomorrow with our very last day of reading this particular book, and then we're going to take a break, and then we'll come back after Thanksgiving on Friday, and we'll be back with a new book to read. I hope that you're having a great and wonderful Motivation Monday. Take care, and thank you for joining me. Thank you again.